Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex and today I'm going to be going over all of my top reads for 2024. So this is going to include my 5-star reads as well as my honorable mentions. I will not be doing a full review of any of these books during this video because I have so many to talk about, so this is going to be a more condensed version of why I think that you should read these books. First up is going to be Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This was my first historical fiction novel set with a Korean family in Japan during the 20th century, and it talks about the discrimination that the family faces. I had no idea before reading this book the history of Korea, how it became North and South Korea, Japan's hand in all of that, the way that they treated Korean immigrants. Had absolutely no clue. And honestly, I attribute that to, at least in the United States, our education system teaches us a very Western perspective of World War I and World War II. We don't typically talk about what was going on in the rest of the world during that time. And so I was just completely ignorant. And I felt like this book in particular was valuable for me and was incredibly enlightening. So not only does it provide a more well-rounded view of historical events, it's also a deeply moving story following 5 generations of one family. The perseverance and resilience of these characters is honestly incredible, and there are parts of the book that will shock you. My friend Cody actually listened to this on audio after I read the physical copy and talked about how much I loved this, and we'd had an entire discussion about it over lunch one day. It is definitely a book that you can sit and discuss with other people, and I highly recommend, if you decide that you want to read this, that maybe you find somebody else to read it with. As long as you go into this with the understanding that this is a deeply tragic story, and while there are glimpses of positive events that happen for the family, a lot of it is very dark and incredibly sad. Up next is going to be The Three-Body Problem by Sushin Leo. Now, I did do an entire long deep dive review video of this book, and I would actually encourage you to go watch that if you want to, so I will link it here. My perspective on this book has changed since I initially read it because in 2024 I read the entire trilogy, and I will say that my enthusiasm, if you will, for the series flagged significantly by the time that I got to the second book because the story just changes in a way that I wasn't expecting it to. So I'm not going to say that The Three-Body Problem doesn't deserve 5 stars, but I will say that my enthusiasm for it has waned a little bit after knowing what comes later on in the series. Now, of course, my perspective is not going to be the same as everybody else's, and a lot of people left me comments because I did a review for each one of the 3 books that their favorite one was actually the last book. So it's possible that you will love later books in the series a lot more than I did, but this one, The Three-Body Problem, will continue to be my favorite of the 3. I really love the concept of this story and the way that it's set up. I enjoy the fact that the technology that is available to our characters is only a little bit more advanced than what we have today, meaning that I could foresee us actually having the technology that they introduce sometime pretty soon in the future. So conceptually, it feels pretty realistic. It also provides a more historical perspective of China because we bounce back and forth between China of Mao's time and modern day China, which again was very interesting for me to learn about. So there was just a lot going on in this story that I felt like was set up in the best way possible. That said, I will tell anybody who typically loves character-driven stories that Sushin Leo is not a good writer of characters. He writes characters in the same fashion as traditional old science fiction, which is that the characters aren't really the important part of the story, they're just the means by which the plot is carried forward. So if you really love The Three-Body Problem, it's going to be because you enjoy the concepts that are presented, not necessarily because you feel an attachment to any particular characters. The next book I want to talk about is the only non-fiction of all of the books that I'm going to talk about today, and that is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Born a Crime remains the only 5-star nonfiction book that I have read, and admittedly I haven't read a ton of nonfiction, but it still remains a shock to me that I loved this book that much, and that's because of how well it is written. Trevor Noah blends the perfect balance of comedy and cynicism together to culminate into a story that doesn't seem like it could be real, but very much was his life. I was sucked in because I've enjoyed him for years as a talk show host, but I will say that this book provided a different perspective of him and a side of him that I'd never seen before. Trevor always came off to me as somebody who's just incredibly handsome and funny and smart and talented and squeaky clean overall. I've never thought of him as having a messy life, but his life very much was messy, and it was hard and it was complicated, and there were parts of it that frankly were quite ugly. I feel like after reading this memoir that I understand him better as a person, and it has successfully humanized him to be a lot more than just a public figure. I think that if you have ever enjoyed him or his comedy, that you should definitely pick up this book. Up next are the Monstrous comics by Marjorie Liu and illustrated by Sana Takeda. Right now I am holding up comics 3 through 5 because these of the 5 volumes that I read last year were the ones that I gave 5 stars. This comic series was recommended to me by my friend Dylan, and then Keaton ended up reading them, and then I got a hold of them, and the rest is history. Admittedly, I didn't know what to think of the story when I started out reading it because it was disjointed, it didn't make a lot of sense, it felt like I was just missing something overall in the narrative, but by the time I had gotten to the 3rd volume, I really felt engrossed into the world and felt like there was a lot being revealed and was making more sense for the overall narrative of the story. I would definitely say that this would be considered mature content, not necessarily because it's overly pornographic or anything like that, but it is incredibly violent and dark, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend giving this to your children. I would definitely say if you are going to decide to pick up the Monstrous comics that you push through the first 2 volumes before you make a decision about how you feel about the series. So if there's any way for you to borrow them or read them online, I definitely think that that would be a great option before you decide to buy them. And then we have Guards by Terry Pratchett. This is the first Discworld novel where we are getting the perspectives of Commander Vimes and his Night's Watch. I really enjoyed this book, and it is regarded by many people as their favorite Discworld novel overall, which is really saying something because there are over 40 Discworld books. While I can't say that this is my favorite Discworld novel because I still have many more to get through, I will say that it is fantastic, and if you are somebody who is looking to start in the Discworld series and you don't care about reading them in the order that they were published, Guards would actually be a wonderful place to start. Up next is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. I was absolutely obsessed with this book when I was reading it, and I finished it in just a few days because of how well this story is told. It was full of unexpected details and is another historical fiction novel about the schools that they would send delinquent boys to in order to be rehabilitated, and as you can imagine, it also gives the racial perspective of the differences between the white boys that were sent to these schools and the boys of color who were sent there, and how the treatment of them, while for all of them was quite awful, especially for the boys of color, was absolutely atrocious. Nickel Academy both mentally and physically scarred these boys for life, and it carried with them into adulthood, something that we do get to see in this narrative as well. I can definitely see why this book is highly regarded. I would encourage everyone to pick this up, and I look forward to reading more Colson Whitehead in the future. How I got the recommendation to read this was a little bit interesting because the creator Kayla from Books and Lala has talked about this multiple times on her channel, and typically her and I have very different reading tastes, but in this case her recommendation was absolutely spot on. My next book is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I definitely will not be spending much time talking about this because this was Kat and I's first Bookworm Club pick that we did an entire live show discussion on. You can go and click here if you end up wanting to watch it and get all of the nitty-gritty details of the story. And while I can absolutely say that I loved this book and I think that it is a wonderful work of fiction, that does not mean that the author who created it is a good person. I feel like that is even more important to state now as we have gotten increased details regarding the allegations against Gaiman. And it makes me so sad to say this, but Neverwhere probably would have been my top choice for books I read in 2024 had I not had a horrible taste left in my mouth by the current controversy. This is absolutely a case of love the story, hate the author, and my recommendation is if you still decide that you want to read this book because you're interested in the story, absolutely you can do that, but please check out a copy from your local library or buy it secondhand. For the love of everything good, do not give him any more of your money. Please. I felt like morally I could not recommend that anybody read this unless I gave that caveat. Gaiman was by far one of my favorite authors, and I can tell you that he will not be getting any more money from me in the future. And if you decide you don't want to read this because it's Gaiman, I respect that decision as well, because frankly, I'm pissed about all of it. These next books that I'm going to talk about were not 5-star reads, but they are notable reads, and I definitely would recommend that you still consider picking these up. Up first for notables is The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. I have not talked about this book previously on my channel other than when I was reading it during my live shows, so this is my first time that I'm bringing this up. However, I have talked before about my enjoyment of one of his other novels, Hell Followed With Us, and I can say that I actually enjoyed The Spirit Bares Its Teeth a little bit more. All of his main characters are trans and talk heavily about their trans identity and how the society that they live in impacts their ability to live their authentic life. There is a paranormal bent to this story and how the society has adapted to certain people being able to commune with spirits. So that part is very interesting. And I also enjoy that Silas has to solve a mystery of what is happening to some missing girls. If you like LGBT books or young adult horror, I would highly recommend this book, and even as somebody who is a regular reader of horror, I am quite impressed to say that there were parts of this book that made even me feel squeamish, so that should tell you something. Medical horror is apparently one of the scariest types of horror to me. I didn't know that. Up next is Boys in the Valley by Philip Fracassi. This was another book club pick for Kat and I, and the live show for this is actually over on her channel. So if you want to, again, hear all the nitty-gritty details about this story, you should definitely go check out Kat's channel linked down below. This is horror of a very different kind, about an evil that infects this Catholic orphanage full of boys, and some of the boys start killing other members of the orphanage. If you like horror that focuses on religion and demons, I would definitely say that this is a story that you would find compelling. I really enjoyed this, and if I remember correctly, this was one of Kat's 5-star reads for last year, and I gave this book 4.5 stars. Up next is another book I haven't really talked about before, and that is The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. This was my first Scalzi novel, and I decided to pick this up because I knew that it previously had been a Hugo Award nominee, and that piqued my interest about it. I'm not necessarily a huge kaiju fan, although I do really enjoy movies like Pacific Rim, so I had a good inkling that I would probably enjoy this, but I didn't realize that I was going to like it as much as I did. This is a fun sci-fi read that is quippy, quick, and never takes itself too seriously. The diversity of the cast of this book honestly is pretty impressive as well, not only with the ethnicity and the sexuality of the characters, but also the gender. There is a non-binary character in the book that isn't just some throwaway placeholder character. They have an important role throughout the entire story, and that was something that I thought was really cool. So again, another LGBT novel, at least an ally novel, I would say, that would be a good one to pick up. I ended up buying a Kindle copy of Starter Villain after reading this book because of how much I enjoyed Scalzi's writing, and Starter Villain was another Hugo Award nominee, so I have a really good feeling I'm probably going to enjoy that one as well. I mean, what can you say? The man had 2 Hugo Award nominees in a row. He's on a roll. It's impressive. But of course, now we have to move on to a book that is much darker and more tonally serious than the last one, and that is Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune. I would describe this book as one that causes the reader to face the idea of death, but in as gentle of a way as possible. I laughed while reading this. I ugly cried. T.J. Klune knows how to pull at my heartstrings. While there are some aspects of this book that I would say could be a bit repetitive, I understand the role that those repetitive pieces were playing in the story, so I didn't dock it that hard. Also, as somebody who is an avid watcher of Ghost Adventures, for the lulz, there were parts of this book that definitely resonated with me. I look forward to reading more Clune in the future and getting my heart absolutely stomped on. Up next is a book that I honestly did not expect to be a part of this list, but I'm very happy that it was, and that is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Now, when I first started reading science fiction, Ray Bradbury was one of the authors that I read the most, and I would praise him until the cows came home. But I took a long hiatus between reading any of his works, and when I went back to read Something Wicked This Way Comes, I was worried that that magic had been broken for me, and that maybe I wasn't going to like his writing quite as much as I had before. And I am incredibly happy to say that I was wrong about that. He builds these atmospheres and narratives that feel so real, despite the fact that they are removed from the world of today. His writing is compelling, and he keeps me wanting to read to find out what he is going to do next, what is going to happen with these characters. And I think that that's incredibly special because of how old these stories are at this point, and it makes me hope that future generations are going to continue to see value in works like his the way that I have. Because I can tell you that when I was growing up, I had no required reading for Bradbury. I didn't need to read Fahrenheit 451. I didn't read The Martian Chronicles or The Illustrated Man. I read all of those on my own as I ventured into my sci-fi journey. And to think that I wouldn't have found him had I not just accidentally picked up a book while I was at Barnes & Noble is kind of a sad thought. So I really do hope that if you have never read a Bradbury novel before, that you will decide to pick up one and see for yourself what his writing has to offer. I think the only real two downsides to Bradbury's stories like Something Wicked This Way Comes are that he can be long-winded with the dialogue. Absolutely 100% would agree with anybody who had that criticism. And the fact that none of his books ever have heroic female characters. That is one gripe that I have, and is definitely a sign of the times. But outside of that, the story is worth it. And finally, ending on a nice, comfy note, we have Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch by Bree Paulson. These are short, comfy, happy graphic novels with an uplifting message, wonderful art, a fantastic color palette, and something that is just going to make you feel good to read. And still to this day, my only complaint about them is that they are not longer. And that is it for all of my favorite books that I read in 2024. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and thank you in advance for your forgiveness of the fact that I kept having lighting issues during this video. The sun did not want to play nice today. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these books or are interested in reading any of these books, because I would love to hear from you. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.